Welcome to Saturday Night at the Movies, the podcast that celebrates classic, cult, and current films and the people that made them, and many other aspects of pop culture. I'm your host, Steve Rubin. Our producer is Ben Shrewsbury, and our signature theme was composed by Greg Lerhoff. Here it's always Saturday night, and our mission is to chronicle film and pop cultural history one memory at a time. Tonight, we welcome filmmaker, author, journalist, occasional actor, multiple Rondo Award winner, and all-around friend to genre filmmaking, Mr. Sam Irvin, whose latest book has a terrific title that Roger Corman and Sam Arkoff would love. I Was a Teenage Monster Hunter. Welcome, Sam.
Hey, how are you, Steve? Thanks for having me.
How could I not? I was trying to think, were you at the Cinefantastic reunion last year?
I was at one of them. I didn't go to the one last year, no. I was at one that was at Creature Features in Burbank when that
Burbank,
was
yes.
still a store.
Yeah, that's where some of us were interviewed for a little video, I believe.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I didn't do a lot with Cinefantastique. I wrote a journal on the making of The Fury, because that was the first film that I worked on actually while I
Right.
was still in college, um, and it was between my junior and senior year in 1977, I guess, and so I wrote that journal. I had been doing my own fanzine on horror films called Bizarre
Right.
from 1972 to 75. But once I started getting involved with De Palma, I didn't have time to do the fanzine anymore. So I wanted to have an outlet to write about him, and so I did get Fred Clark to let me write this journal. So that was great fun. And Fred had always been a great supporter of my fanzine. In fact, he even bought a 2-page ad one time, and I'm like, you don't need me to get people to buy Cinefantastique.
Well,
I mean,
he was my introduction to the business because I used to ride my bike up to Larry Edmunds' bookshop on Hollywood
yeah.
Boulevard, and one day I was looking at the stacks and I saw a copy of Cinefantastic and had the George Pal cover,
Oh
and I'm
yeah.
a big George Pal fan, so I bought that magazine, and then yeah, that was the opening of a big door to me because I was writing my combat films book at that time, and I was
Yeah.
interviewing Ted Scherderman on a World War II movie called Hell to Eternity. And during the course of that interview, and this is long before the internet, back in the early 70s, he says, that reminded me of what I did on Them. And I looked at him like, what? You wrote Them? And I didn't know he wrote them because I didn't have an instant list of his credits. So
Yeah.
I wrote
We didn't buy IMDb back then.
So I wrote Fred a letter, and all of a sudden, I had an assignment to write an article on the making of Them, interviewing Ted Scherderman and also Gordon Douglas, who also agreed to an interview. So that was great. But let's go back a lot further. I always find it interesting to talk with my guests about their boyhood and girlhood. Just where you first discovered movies. Were you a movie-going family? Was movies a big deal with you guys?
It certainly was. My dad owned movie theaters, and in fact, my grandfather was also in the movie theater business. I grew up in Asheville, North Carolina, and my grandfather was the district manager for the Wilby Kinsey theater chain that had theaters all over the Southeast. And then my dad got into the business as a competitor and started his own chain with a business partner, and it was the Irvin Fuller Theaters. And the flagship was in my hometown in Asheville, but they had theaters in other cities in North and South Carolina, and there are about 16 of them. And so my playground was being in a movie theater. I was like the little kid in Cinema Paradiso, hanging out in the projection booth and collecting the posters and popping popcorn and you name it. But from the earliest age, I was seeing films. I saw the first horror movie that I remember seeing was Pit and the Pendulum in 1961 at my dad's theater, the Plaza in Asheville, North Carolina. I was 5 years old, and it just completely blew me away. I fell in love with Vincent Price. I fell in love with Roger Corman. I fell in love with Edgar Allan Poe series of
Oh,
movies.
wait a minute. First of all, did the movie scare the
Oh,
crap out of you?
totally scared the crap out of me. And luckily, my parents were not, overly protective about me seeing horror films or anything really back in those days. And so I was allowed to see it, and it gave me nightmares, and I loved it. I couldn't wait for more, and I wanted to see more and more and more. I was just completely hooked. And then I was also, like all of us kids back in those days, I watched Shock Theater on the local ABC channel, which was, of course, the syndicated package of films that Screen Gems put together in these packages called Shock, and they had licensed mostly Universal classics, and that's where I was introduced to all of the great Universal movies, and especially for me, Bride of Frankenstein, which is my all-time favorite film to this day. And I just fell in love with the genre and was, subscribed to Famous Monsters of Filmland and had all the Aurora model kits and just everything. And, I collected the Super 8. Well, originally 8 millimeter. I was even collecting films when it was still 8 millimeter, and then it went to Super 8 millimeter, and the record albums with monster movie themes, and I was just your stereotypical monster kid.
Now, I lived across the street from Fox West Coast Stadium on Pico near Robertson. And in those
Yeah.
days, I don't know if this was indicative of the whole country, but they had Saturday morning double features featuring all science fiction horror stuff. I assume that your dad embraced that.
No,
No.
I embraced that. And I held a gun to my dad's head to let me book kiddie matinees on Saturday mornings of horror movies. And I did it from literally like the age of like 10. And I was designing the flyers and cutting things out of press books and everything. And it was my that was my turf. And I would book, I had a retrospective of all the Vincent Price, Edgar Allan Poe, Roger Corman movies, and then I would do a retrospective of all the Hammer Dracula movies, and then I do all the Hammer Frankenstein movies, and then I would book films that had never played in Nashville that I wanted to see, and I was such a spoiled kid, and it just was incredible, and it really gave me. I mean, it taught me stuff about graphic design. We're designing these flyers, which led to all sorts of uh, career things. I was head of marketing in the '80s for different film companies, and won Hollywood Reporter Key Art Awards for posters that I designed. But that all went back to my self-taught sort of design, graphic design work back in those days, and then marketing and all this stuff is just it was
I assume that these kiddie matinees were well attended.
very well attended, and I made sure that we had double bills, like you said, and I made sure that they were over in time for kids to get home to see Shock Theater on Saturday afternoon, which came on right after Dick Clark's American Bandstand. And it was just every monster kid in the whole area were out for these things, and they were hugely attended. And I eventually, I mean, here was my marketing brain. I eventually changed the name from Kitty Matinees, because I thought that sounded really, who wants to be associated with something with kitty in the name? And there was this short-lived magazine called Monster Mania that had like 3 issues, which I really loved. It was a great magazine. And I just love that name, Monster Mania. So I formed the Monster Mania Club, and that's what we called these Saturday meetings where we would watch films. And I had a membership card with the frequent flyer thing on the bottom, where each time you came you would get it punched, and if you got it punched 5 times, your sixth one would be free. You would get in free, and you'd get a new card and start all over again. um so yeah, my marketing brain was already,
Sure, sure, sure. Well, you know, it's interesting. Back in the late 50s and 60s, genre filmmaking was kind of a side thing of Hollywood. You know,
yeah,
almost like the studios did a few A-list type movies like Forbidden Planet and The Day the Earth Stood Still and The Thing, but most of that turf was owned by the Roger Cormans and Sam Irvin,
yes,
et cetera. And now here it is, 2024, which sounds like deep in the future, and
yeah.
genre filmmaking almost dominates Hollywood. In fact, I would argue that there are very few other kinds of movies made every year.
Yeah, no, it's true. It has really gone from the ghetto to, the top of the heap. It's just all the A-list movies are, I mean, certainly even just the comic book movies of, superhero stuff is genre stuff that was ghettoized way back in our day.
Oh yeah.
And it's all just, it's all there. So it's pretty exciting to see that evolution.
Well, let's talk a little bit about Brian De Palma, because obviously Brian De Palma is there at the beginning of your career as how did you find yourself on the set of a Brian De Palma movie?
Well, I just absolutely fell in love with Phantom of the Paradise and Sisters. Those two films just were mind-blowing to me. And up until that time, I was, really just a fanatic about Hammer Films and Vincent Price and all of that. And I was starting to think career-wise, how could I immigrate to London and work for Hammer Films and everything? But at the same time, I knew that was going to be really hard to do, and to get my foot into an industry in a whole nother country and to move to another country. And I sensed that that genre was really on its last legs. It was really starting in the mid by 75, Hammer was really limping along. And I just felt like, that's not where it's happening. And I had this instinct that when I saw those two Brian De Palma films, that he was an American director. It tied into horror and also Hitchcock, who I was a huge fan of. Um, and I just felt like this was a more attainable goal where I could try to work with him and learn from De Palma. And so I was going to the University of South Carolina, and I decided to, and I was already in my freshman year, I was already head of the campus movie theater, where we put on movies 365 days a year. And we did kind of art house films and foreign films during the week for free, but on the weekends we'd show a little bit more commercial films and charge very small admission. I think it was like $1 or $2. And with that money, we would be able to pay for the entire program and do the free movies during the week. And we had a surplus in our budget, and we could do special events. And I decided, I just organized a Brian De Palma Film Festival, and I got 16 millimeter prints for Phantom of the Paradise and Sisters, and a couple of his earlier films, Greetings and Hi Mom, both with Robert De Niro in the early part of his career. And I was like, how do I get in touch with Brian? This is 1975, and I am 19, I guess. And I looked at my dad's Hollywood Reporter in the production charts, and it had a listing for Carrie that was in early stages of pre-production, and it had a phone number for a casting office in Los Angeles. Now, I knew Brian lived in New York, but I figured, okay, well, he's out in LA, prepping this movie. And I just called up the number cold, and they put him right on the phone. Now, that would never happen nowadays, of
Oh, there's
course.
like 20, there's 25 gatekeepers now.
Yes, 25 gay viewers, but they just put him right on the phone. And also remember, he really hadn't had a hit film. The Phantom of the Paradise was a big disappointment, and Sisters was just, a small, American international release that did mostly drive-ins. He wasn't, it wasn't like I'm, calling up Steven Spielberg at the height of his career either. Um, but it turns out, I didn't realize it at the time, but at the casting sessions that he was doing for Carrie, it turned out those are probably the most influential casting sessions in the history of cinema, because he and George Lucas were casting their films together. They were sitting at a table together at these casting sessions, casting Carrie and Star Wars. And every actor that came into the room read scenes from both movies.
Oh,
And
that's
then
funny.
if they liked somebody, they would have to fight over who was going to get them. But anyway, I didn't know that at the time. But they put Brian on. I explained what I was doing, and he said, "Oh, no one's ever done a film festival of my stuff. That sounds cool. Yeah, I'll come. If you can give me airfare because I live in New York and I need some stuff in my apartment and I'm broke. If you can give me the airfare from Los Angeles to South Carolina and then to New York so I can be there for the weekend and then back to LA, I'll come for the Triangle airfare." And I said, done. And he came out, met him, took him to film classes. He brought, he was drawing storyboards of his latest film, Obsession, which hadn't come out yet, but had finished shooting. And he brought a cassette tape of the Bernard Herrmann score cues that they had literally just finished recording. And this was in November of 1975. And Bernard Herrmann was still alive. And he told us that he was right now, at that moment, composing the score for Martin Scorsese's Taxi Driver,
Right.
which was then recorded just a couple of weeks later in December. And Bernard Herrmann, after the very last session of those recordings, went to his hotel in New York. I think that's where they were doing it, and he died of a heart attack.
Well,
But this is like 3 or 4 weeks earlier, and Brian is playing these cues from Obsession that no one had ever even heard. In fact, the movie was still called Deja Vu. It wasn't even called Obsession yet. Columbia Pictures changed the title once they acquired it and released it the following fall. So we were getting this incredible preview of these great Bernard Herrmann cues. And he was talking about how Bernard Herrmann had agreed to do the score for Carrie for his next film, which of course couldn't happen after he passed away. But it was all just incredible stuff. And then, so after that, I stayed in touch with Brian. And between my junior and senior year, in the summer of 77, I knew that he was going to be shooting The Fury on location in Chicago. And now I had his home phone number, and I called him up and said, is there any way I could come up and be a production assistant or anything on The Fury during my summer break? And he said, sure, come on up. So I worked as his assistant on that movie that summer. And I also got an assignment from Fred Clark at Cine Fantastique to do the article on the making of the film, which allowed me to request one-on-one interviews with everybody, from Kirk Douglas to John Cassavetes to Brian, to even during post-production, I went to New York during my Christmas break where they were editing the movie, and I met Paul Hirsch, who edited Star Wars, and interviewed him. And I even got on the phone with John Williams, who was doing the score for it, and had a brief interview with him.
And that's a terrific score also. I mean, I have
it's one of his best. I love that score.
Yeah, it's funny. The Fury for me is a little bit of a mixed blessing. I love the music, but I thought the movie it got a little too dark for me and at the end. But Andrew Stevens was very powerful as the kid.
Yeah.
Amy Irving, his first time we're seeing her, Amy Irving was terrific. And Brian, I think for many years was kind of the modern Hitchcock. I mean, he really took a lot of Did Brian ever talk much about Hitchcock with you in terms
Oh,
of influence?
constantly. No, he was absolutely worshipped Hitchcock, and I had taken courses on Hitchcock. I was a huge Hitchcock fan, so we talked about him all the time and talked about his movies. And no, Brian, he's doesn't hide his love of Hitchcock by any means. And he certainly, some people will argue he ripped him off. Other people will argue, well, no, those are homages. But however you want to describe it, his films are just loaded with Hitchcockian references. And and so yeah, I mean, I loved all of that, and I thought that even the movies that were not necessarily great, all around, they always had incredibly interesting set pieces, beautiful sequences, incredible scores, really interesting actors. There's always something to enjoy and love in a De Palma film. And um, and I had gone to film school at the University of South Carolina, but my real film school was when I started working with Brian. So what happened after The Fury is that I went back and completed my senior year. And then he called me in May of 78, just as I was about to graduate. And unbeknownst to me, if I had known, I would have tried to transfer schools. But he taught that spring, he taught a semester at Sarah Lawrence College in New York, on screenwriting. And he had a treatment for a comedy called Home Movies, and he had the class, well, divided up the students to write different scenes, and throughout the semester they honed it into a completed script. And so he called me up and explained all of this and said, I've decided that I want to direct this movie this summer as a low budget film. And I'm going to have the people that were in the class, the kids that were in the class, to work on the crew and learn. And we're going to do it. We're going to base ourselves at Sarah Lawrence College. We're going to live in the dorms and shoot it, and I want you to come up and work on it if you would like. And I'm like, would I like? Yes. And so I just finished my last exam. I didn't even wait for the graduation ceremony. I got on the plane and went right up there. And I just thought I was going to work on it like I had worked on The Fury, kind of as his assistant. But he said, no, you're going to be the associate producer and production manager. And he just kind of threw me into the deep end to see if I could swim. And apparently I did okay, because after that, he hired me full time as his full time assistant. And kind of, he had a little, he was developing his own projects. And so you could call it like a little development company that was, had exactly two people, him and me.
And
And I would,
you were based in New York?
we were based in New York, yeah. And so I would read scripts and give him script reports, and just all that kind of development company sort of thing. And it was just incredible. And I worked on Dress to Kill, and I worked.
I actually want to bring up an image of that, because
Oh yeah, great. That is fantastic.
Definitely, because and that was the shot of him with Michael. To this day, whenever I walk into an elevator, I look both ways,
I
because
know it.
it's almost like the shower sequence in Psycho. It changed the course of elevator visits for me.
It does. It's like, well, it's like Jaws. I never went in the ocean again without being terrified and looking around for fins. I mean, no, it did to elevators exactly that. And I actually, they were, while we were shooting it, they were very worried. For people who haven't seen it, sorry, there's a little bit of a spoiler here, but it's been out for a while, folks. You know how Janet Leigh gets bumped off in the shower in Psycho after,
Right.
the first 30 minutes. Well, Angie Dickinson gets bumped off in the elevator after about 30 minutes or 30 minutes or whatever. And so it's very much obviously, borrowed from Psycho in that sense. And but they were very, Brian was like worried that it would get out that Angie gets stabbed in the elevator and early in the film and all that kind of stuff. So there was kind of an embargo of they were being very careful to not take too many pictures of the elevator, and whatever pictures they did take, they were trying to make sure they didn't get released to the press and all that kind of stuff. Well, so I was like, I have to have a picture of myself with Angie Dickinson in the elevator with all the blood. And I did get a picture of myself with her. I got the wardrobe person who was taking Polaroids for continuity to grab a quick Polaroid of us. And I still have that picture to this day. We'll have to, I can find it and send it to you, and you can show it to your viewers.
How,
You
how
can edit it in.
Sam, how would you describe the work methodology of Brian? I mean, every director has their own way they do things. Given that he's such an artistic director, was it fairly slow and methodical on the set, or was he a quick shooter?
He was a fairly quick shooter, but the thing is, he worshipped Hitchcock, not just the finished product, but the whole way in which Hitchcock worked. And Hitchcock designed and planned out his films in pre-production, like, down to every detail, storyboarding them, just everything was done in pre-production. And that's how I learned how to really organize your film and come in with a game plan that was very specific. And Brian in his office, and it was formerly his apartment, and he had, once he became, started making money, he bought a much nicer condominium at 1 Fifth Avenue, and this was his former apartment at 25 Fifth Avenue. And we would in the living, well, there was 2 little tiny bedrooms. One was his office and one was my office, but my office also had all the file cabinets and everything was stored in there. But in the living room is where he would hold meetings. But he had me, I got these people to come in and install cork boards on all the walls. And he would storyboard his films by drawing them on little blank business card size white cards. And with push pins, he would tack them up on the cork board. And so scene 1, and it would be a row of cards that would go down as many frames that he needed for it. Some scenes would be a ton of cards, other short scenes, it's a phone call and it's just 1 card or 2. And the next scene could be 20, it was just varied all the way around the room. And when he would have meetings with, say, the actors and stuff, he would like a maestro, would get up and sort of give them a tour of the movie that was going to be shot. He would go, and then in this scene, you can see that we're going to do this, and he would point to the different cards. And one of my jobs was to take the cards down, put code numbers on the back so I could put them back up, but I would lay them out on the glass on the Xerox machine and print them out so that we could distribute those storyboards to the different department heads. And then I would have to put the cards back up. And when he would revise them or change things, I would, have to keep up with all of those changes. But that's how he would plan his films, very, very, very specifically. He wasn't a great artist, so it was just kind of stick figure-y stuff. Some, like Hitchcock, would hire storyboard artists, and you'd see some beautiful storyboards and stuff. There isn't anything like that. But for practical purposes, this, got the message across, and it got, it got whatever he was thinking in his head down on paper, so that all of the rest of the crew and everybody could understand what the game plan was. And so he would go into it, on a day of shooting, he would have Xeroxes that I had made of all the storyboards. And, he would work with the DP, the director of photography, and they would just, check off the shot list, basically. And that's kind of how I work. I am even a worse artist than he is. So I don't necessarily storyboard stuff, but I shot list everything ahead of time and describe exactly what I want for each shot very specifically. And I just, I think it's absolutely essential. I am not a proponent of walking onto the set without a game plan and scratching your head and going, how are we going to shoot this? I just think you end up wasting time and money, and you don't have the luxury of that. Certainly on the low budget movies I do, I nowadays I'm shooting, movies in 12 days, and there is no time to waste, believe me.
Sam, what was Brian's feeling about rehearsal? Would he do multiple rehearsals or
No,
no?
no, not much in the way of rehearsal. And again, I learned so much from him, and I follow so much of what he does. He would hire great actors, and he would let them do their thing. And I always describe myself as a reactive director, and I react to what I let I'll call a rehearsal. We'll do a camera rehearsal, and we'll make sure that we get marks and where everybody's going to be moving for the blocking and that sort of thing. But I want to see what the actors bring to the table before I start giving them notes. And on many times what I see is exactly, perfect, and I won't give any notes. But if I do feel it needs a little bit of tweakage or whatever, I will give minimal notes and that sort of thing. And that's kind of the way that Brian worked as well. But he had very, very specific ideas on the blocking, on the composition of the frames and everything. So he was pretty dictatorial about that stuff. And boy, am I. I tell actors right up front, I said, do not come thinking that we're gonna spend an hour figuring, oh, but I think my character would walk over here when I do that. Nope, I've already figured it out. And we have every shot designed to, we know exactly what's going to be in the background, so the background of every shot has nice depth, it's beautiful and all that. As soon as you start messing with that, suddenly you're going to have an actor that's up against a white wall and 2 inches away from it with no depth, and it's going to look like shit. And so yeah, I'm totally like De Palma in that way, and very dictatorial in terms of the blocking.
Do you keep in touch with him today? Do you stay in touch with him?
I don't, unfortunately. I became very close friends with Nancy Allen when they were married and together, and of course had worked with her. She was in Home Movies. Home Movies, by the way, even though it was a little tiny, low budget comedy, it had Kirk Douglas, who I had worked with on The Fury, and Nancy Allen, Keith Gordon, Garrett Graham, who was Beef and in Phantom of the Paradise. But at any rate, that was the first movie that Nancy Allen and Keith Gordon had done together, and then were reteamed the following year in Dress to Kill. So I worked with Nancy on Home Movies and Dress to Kill, and we became very good friends. And I later directed Nancy in a Showtime thriller called Acting on Impulse. But when they split up, as what happens with a lot of marriages when there's a divorce, the friends kind of get divided up in the divorce as well. And I was kind of a little more team Nancy, I guess. And so, yeah, I've lost, there wasn't any falling out or anything, but it just kind of faded and lost touch over the years. But it's unfortunate, but at any rate, that's just what it is.
It's funny. I did a little catching up with his filmography the other night. I had never seen Carlito's Way.
Uh-huh.
Carlito's Way is a terrific mob thriller.
Yeah, yeah.
I really enjoy. Are you a fan of that film? Do you like that film?
I do like that film. I do. I mean, I do feel that my favorite film he's ever done is Carrie. I still absolutely adore. I mean, if I have to like list my top five, they're all from the early days. You know, it's Carrie, Phantom of the Paradise, Sisters, Dress to Kill. Um, you know, it's that era where he really spoke to me. Those were the genre films that I love, and he was just dabbling in all of the Hitchcockian stuff and everything that I just absolutely adore. Um,
Did you
but I
did you ever ask him about the end of Carrie, about that shot of the that rather startling ending to Carrie? Was that a spontaneous move, or do you think that was planned all along?
It was planned, and it was definitely planned. They he had all kinds of weird things going on in that sequence because you know, you're not supposed to know that it's a dream
Right.
sequence,
Isn't there
but
something about the people walking backwards? Something like
yes, he shot it when there's the shot of Amy Irving coming down the street. That's, I think it's even in slow motion, if I'm not mistaken. Um, and on her way to the burned down house lot where the hand comes up and grabs her. But if you look in the background, there's a Volkswagen on a side street crossing the street, but it's backwards, and it's because they shot it backwards. And he, I don't think that I'm 90% sure that they did not plan to have that car cross, but De Palma loved that it crossed at just that moment and kept it in the cut, and it just is just one little tiny subliminal thing that something's off here. This is not, there's something not quite right here. But they definitely had Amy, you know, walking backwards on the when they were shooting
right.
it, and so I just love that kind of stuff that he would do. Um, and you know, the split screen things that he did, you know, I feel he puts a lot of split screens in his movies. I don't think he's ever topped himself from one of the earliest times he did it in Sisters. I thought that was the most brilliant use of split screen because and again, he's borrowing from Rear Window, the great Hitchcock film. It's one of my all-time favorites. But Jennifer Salt is a journalist, and she's in her apartment building across the street, and she's just working at her typewriter or whatever. She looks across the street into a window where she thinks she sees a murder taking place, and it is, well, it goes into split screen, and she's like calling the police and trying to get them to believe that she, you know, what she saw. And in the meantime, you know, they've drawn Bill Finley, who's the kind of mad doctor in that, and trying to cover up this murder that Margot Kidder has committed. He's closed the curtains, and they're cleaning up the body and the blood and all this stuff on one side of the screen, and Margot Kidder's getting the police to come, and then she's going down the elevator, and the police arrive, and then they cross the street, and they're going up the elevator. And in the meantime, on the other side of the screen is they're hurrying to get everything cleaned up before anybody arrives at the door. And I thought that was just a brilliant use of split screen. And I think a lot of other times that Brian has done it, there hasn't been that strong of a motivation for it. And it feels like a cool stylistic thing, but it lacks a lot of the excitement of that. I just thought the suspense of that sequence is his top use of split screen.
Well, you started to dabble in filmmaking early on. I know you made some shorts and you got into feature
Yeah.
films. I don't think we have enough time to talk about all your films, but I would like
Yeah,
I know there are many, but let me pull up a couple of select ones, which I thought because you have a very eclectic filmography.
I
Uh,
do.
I have to talk a little bit of, and I know you didn't direct it, but you got involved in a very classy film called Gods and Monsters, which
Yes.
featured a marvelous cast and a terrific Ian McKellen part as James Whale. How did you get involved in that project?
Well, I had read a book called Father of Frankenstein by Christopher Bram that was all about James Whale, who, of course, was the director of Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein, my favorite film of all time, The Invisible Man, The Old Dark House. And he was an openly gay director. I'm gay, and I have always just absolutely worshipped his films, and he was very inspirational to me as someone who was out in Hollywood. And being out in Hollywood in the 30s was really, groundbreaking. Um, and I think that Bride of Frankenstein is just absolutely loaded with gay subtext. And even before I realized I was gay, I was already tapped into that, the whole outsider theory of how the monster is this freak of nature misunderstood by society. In other words, me. And it just all of his stuff resonated with me in profound ways that only increased as I got older and really understood how these things had gotten to me on such a deep level. But anyway, when I read this book, Father of Frankenstein, it was about James Whale's later life up until his suicide, and he had become, in his retirement, had become an artist, and he decides that he wants to paint this beautiful young gardener played by Brendan Fraser. And the two of them develop. So Brendan, the character that Brendan plays, agrees to pose for him, and while this whole relationship develops, that they realize they have all these things in common, and it's a really beautiful and incredibly touching film. Well, there's in these discussions that they have, he ends up talking about directing Bride of Frankenstein, and there's a flashback on the set of Bride of Frankenstein, and I just thought, oh my God, if I could direct a movie where I could do a flashback of James Whale directing Bride of Frankenstein, that would just be the ultimate. And so I got in touch with the writer, the novelist, and Chris said that, I said, could I possibly option it? I don't have much money, but and he said, well, you're a couple weeks late because a guy named Bill Condon just optioned it. And he wants to direct it and write it and write the script and everything. And I said, oh my God, I know Bill Condon. I actually knew him through Nancy Allen. He had written a couple of films that Nancy had been in, and I'd met him at a couple of her parties. And so I called him up and congratulated him, said if there's anything I could do to help, I would do anything to see this just get made. And by the way, have you thought of Ian McKellen to play James Whale? And he goes, oh my God, I can't believe you said that. It's exactly who I want for it. And I just sent him a copy of the book, and I'm hoping that he'll respond well to it. And I said, well, it's just great. So we were already kind of on the same wavelength about it. So flash forward a year, I'm prepping a film that I wrote and directed called Kiss of a Stranger at a company called Regent Entertainment. And it was headed up by Paul Collishman. And I had already directed even my first film, Guilty as Charged, for Paul when he was at another company called IRS Media. But anyway, I knew him very well. And I heard him in the hallway mention Father of Frankenstein to someone. And I jumped up out of my chair and went out in the hall and said, Father of Frankenstein, what's going on? And he goes, well, we got this script from Bill Condon, and he's attached Ian McKellen, and he's looking for a company to produce this and to get the financing together. And I said, Paul, you have to do this movie. And I just badgered them until they did it. And I said, and I have to work on it as one of the. I ended up getting a credit of co-executive producer, and it was just the most phenomenal film. And I'm actually glad that Bill Condon did it, because he did such a brilliant job. I don't think that I would have done as good a job as he did, and he refused to take no for an answer on so many things that I probably would have been too nice to be demanding about, and got this incredible cast together. And it
So
was
I can't recall. I can't recall, but there is a flashback to Bride
Yes.
of Frankenstein. So did you get a chance to spend some time on that set?
Oh, yes. And I made sure that that set was built to specification to look exactly like it. And we even found some of Kenneth Strickfaden's original electrical equipment that was used in Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein. And Mel Brooks had found it and used it in Young Frankenstein. And it had even been in this really low budget B movie called Dracula versus Frankenstein in the late 70s that had John Carradine and Forrest J. Ackerman and stuff. And I remember reading about that equipment in Famous Monsters of Filmland. And when Forrest J. Ackerman was saying, oh, and we found it for this thing. So it was just a total fanboy monster kid thing where I had to have that equipment for that set, and we made sure we got it.
So you didn't direct that, but you do have a directing credit called Elvira's Haunted Hills.
Yes.
I know that. Now obviously Elvira, for those who are listening and watching, is she's an icon. She's been an icon for many years as the princess of what do they call her? The princess of
Mistress of the Dark.
Mistress of the Dark. Thank you very much. How did you hook up? How did you hook up, quote unquote, hook up with Elvira?
Okay, so all right, it's a little bit of a long story, but it's pretty cool. I I was friends with Terry Sweeney of Saturday Night Live fame. He was the first openly gay member of the cast in 1985. He and his now husband, Lanier Laney, I had gone to school with Lanier at the University of South Carolina, which is how I got to know them in New York when I moved to New York and was working for De Palma and everything. And they would have me come, and they were writers. Both of them were comedy writers on Saturday Night Live for many years, but Terry was just an on-screen cast member for that 1 year in '85. But anyway, they would have me come to tapings and stuff, so I got to kind of be around Saturday Night Live a bit, which was so much fun. And when I moved to LA, they had also moved to LA around the same time and had become writers on Mad TV. So they knew every comic genius in the world. I mean, they knew the Saturday Night Live people, the Groundlings, the Second City, you name it. And they invited me to a party, and I spotted Cassandra Peterson, who is Elvira, over in the corner, and I went over to Terry and I grabbed him and I said, Terry, I am such a fan of Cassandra Peterson. You have to introduce me. And so he took me over and introduced me to her. I had just directed my first feature film called Guilty as Charged with Rod Steiger. It was a dark comedic horror film about a madman who kidnaps murderers who've gotten off, puts them on his own death row in his dungeon, and fries them in his own electric chair, as one does. And
Got to put
so,
a picture of that.
yes. And there you go. Very good. Yes, that's Rod Steiger and Lauren Hutton. It also had Heather Graham and Zelda Rubinstein from Poltergeist and everything. And Isaac Hayes as well. So Terry introduces me to Cassandra, and he says, and I'm starting to genuflect and, fanboy to her. And Terry says, Sam is a director. He just did his first film called Guilty as Charged. And Cassandra goes, oh, I just saw that film. In fact, I've been wanting to meet you because if I ever do a second Elvira film, I want to consider you as a possible director for it. And I'm like, what? This is incredible. So we became friends. I invited her to play a little cameo role, not as Elvira, but as a bouncer at a country western bar. And she wore a blonde wig and did sort of a Dolly Parton thing in my second film called Acting on Impulse, the one with Nancy Allen. And then she invited me to the taping of an Elvira show pilot for CBS that was terrific and should have gotten off the ground, but didn't get picked up. And it was a 3-camera thing in front of a live audience. And she would invite me to her parties and we would socialize and stuff and became friends. Well, years went by because I met her in 91, but it wasn't until about 98 or 99. She calls me and she said, listen, everybody in town has turned down the idea of doing a second Elvira film. So my husband and I finally decided we're going to finance it ourselves. We're mortgaging our house and everything. Um, and we're interviewing directors. My husband wants to be in on the decision because it's such a financial, crapshoot and risk on our part. Would you please come up for a meeting with the two of us? So I went up to their house and she hands me the script for Elvira's Haunted Hills and says, Sam, this is a spoof of the Vincent Price, Edgar Allan Poe, Roger Corman movies. Are you familiar with those? And I go, Cassandra, Vincent Price, his monologue at the climax of Pit and the Pendulum. Do you know where you are, Bartolome? You're about to enter hell. Hell, the netherworld, the infernal region, the abode of the damned, a place of torment, Gehenna, Naraka, the pit, and the pendulum, the razor edge of destiny. Thus the condition of man, bound on an island from which he can never or hope to escape, surrounded by the waiting pit of hell, which must destroy him finally. Now, she looks at me, cocks her head like I'm completely crazy, and says, you're hired. And that's how I got the job. Now, you might ask, how did I know that model? And how do I even still know it now? Okay, when I was in junior high school, the teacher assigned us to learn monologues. And she had in mind, like Shakespeare. And I am not a fan of Shakespeare. I am allergic to iambic pentameter. And I begged her to let me do something instead. And I was thinking, what could I, recommend that would sound academic to her? And I said, could I do Edgar Allan Poe? And it worked. And she said, okay. So I raced home. This is when I'm like 13, probably late 60s. Nobody had home video back then, but I recorded the soundtracks off of the speaker of the TV on reel-to-reel tape recorders. This is before cassette tapes. That's how.
You and I are kindred spirits because
Yeah.
the biggest thing that ever happened to me early on was buying my friend's reel-to-reel tape recorder and putting the microphone up against the TV speaker. Absolutely.
Precisely. That's exactly what I'd done. So I had Pit and the Pendulum, and I raced home and I transcribed that whole monologue and went in the next day and got an A. Of course, the teacher, had no idea. It wasn't Edgar Allan Poe's words. It was Richard Matheson's words, who wrote the script of that movie. But it didn't matter. I snuck and pulled the wool over her eyes and got an A. So then, like a year later, it was 1970. I was 14. A production of Oliver was being performed on stage in Atlanta, Georgia, which was a 4-hour drive from our hometown in Asheville, North Carolina. And I put a gun to my mother's head and said, you have to drive me there because the role of Fagin is being played by Vincent Price. And she took me down there and we went to the backstage door afterwards so I could meet him. And I brought along a flyer of my, kiddie matinees or Monster Mania Club meetings on Saturday mornings at my dad's theater, where I had shown all the Edgar Allan Poe, Vincent Price movies. And I brought this flyer to show him. He was very impressed. He also thought my name was amazing because my name's Sam Irvin. There was a very famous North Carolina senator, a Democrat back in those days, named Senator Sam Irvin. He spelled it Ervin, but it's pronounced exactly like Irvin, like my name. And he said, oh, you must be related to Senator Sam Irvin. And I go, no. And I explained how we spell it differently. But that stuck in his head. And then I said, and by the way, I know your monologue from Pit and the Pendulum. He said, oh, you do not. And I said, yes, I do. And I did it for him. And there was a line of other fans. And when I finished, there was applause. So I made an impression on him. A year later, he was doing a lecture tour series on college campuses. And he did one in Charlotte, North Carolina. And I got my mother again, because I'm still too young to drive me to that. And I go and at the stage door, and as soon as he sees me, he goes, "Sam, what are you doing here?" Because he remembered my name, he remembered me, and he turned to the people in line and he said, "This young man knows the monologue from Pit and the Pendulum." And like I was performing monkey, he makes me, do the monologue for them and got another applause. Then, I'm sorry this is so long, but it's too cool to not mention. Then in 1974, I graduated from high school and I got my parents to send me to London as a graduation present so I could interview all my horror film royalty my idols, so that I could interview them for my fanzine Bazaar. And I spent the day with Christopher Lee on the set of Man with the Golden Gun. And you would think, oh, that's probably enough for one day for a fanboy. No. That night, I decided I wanted to go see Pygmalion on the West End because it starred Diana Rigg. Now, I was a huge fan of Diana Rigg because she had played Emma Peel in The Avengers. She had played the best Bond girl ever in On Her Majesty's Secret Service. But most importantly, she played Vincent Price's daughter in Theater of Blood. And I definitely wanted to interview her. I hadn't been able to get in touch. And so I thought I'd just go to the stage door after, try to meet her and see if I could bamboozle my way into getting an interview from her. So I sit down in the theater, and before the curtain even opens, I hear this very familiar laugh, and I turn around, and it's Vincent Price sitting right behind me. And before I can open my mouth, he goes, "Sam, what are you doing here?" And, and then he introduces me to his new fiancée, Coral Brown, who he had met on Theater of Blood. He kills her. She's one of the theater critics. And they had been introduced by none other than Diana Rigg. And so I explained that I was there because I wanted to interview Diana Rigg. And he went, "Oh, you're coming backstage with us afterwards." And he brings me back and he introduces me to Diana Rigg. And he says, "This young man knows my monologue from Pit and the Pendulum." And he makes me do it for Diana Rigg. So I'm telling you, I've gotten more mileage out of learning that monologue than anything, including on this podcast. So anyway, that's the crazy story of how I got the job on Elvira's Haunted Hills. It's a pretty cool story, don't you think?
Now, before we finish, I've got to pull up another film because I actually worked on one of your films. You probably don't remember.
No way.
But I was in charge of production publicity at Showtime for 10 years.
Oh my God.
And I was
that's
there.
That's how I know your name, of course.
Out there. I remember being on that set.
Wow.
Absolutely.
Steve, that is the coolest thing.
You made a Showtime. Well, you made a number of Showtime originals.
Yeah, the Acting on Impulse with Nancy Allen was Showtime. And
right.
And out there was, oh my God, that was the most fun film. It was a UFO comedy. It starred Billy Campbell, who was the Rocketeer. And it also had Rod Steiger, who we had gotten along so well on Guilty as Charged, where he played the leading role. I asked him if he would play this cameo in this as this very eccentric general, and he loved it, and it was so much fun. And we had another guy who was kind of working his way up in the industry at the time. And he was telling us, I got him to come in and play. Billy Campbell gets thrown in jail for a night, and his jail cellmate is this weird guy. And the producer of the film knew this actor who was doing a series called Hearts of Fire with John Ritter at the same studio. We were shooting it at CBS Radford Studios, and we saw that Larry Estes was the producer, and we saw this actor at the commissary, and Larry said, "Oh, I want you to introduce you to this guy. He might be good to play the role in the jail cell." And so we had lunch, hit it off and everything. And he said, "Yeah, I've got that day off. I'd love to come do that scene." So he came and did that scene, and he was telling us about how as soon as they got there on hiatus, he was going off to direct a film that he had written, and he was going to be starring in it. And low budget independent film. and he started doing the voice of the character that he was going to play, which was very strange. And we're all looking at each other, well, good luck with that. And it was a little film called Sling Blade. And yes, I'm talking about Billy Bob Thornton.
Oh my God.
And which he won an Oscar for. So, it was crazy, because we had Rod Steiger, who was already an Oscar winner. Then we had Billy Bob Thornton, who was very soon to be an Oscar winner. And then Billy Campbell was still dating at the time his co-star from Rocketeer, who happened to be Academy Award winner Jennifer Connelly.
Oh my goodness.
So in the grocery store scene, we didn't have enough extras. And I said, and she was visiting Bill, and I said, Jennifer, come here. You be my wife in line at the grocery store right behind Bill and Julie Brown, who was in the cast. And so I have 3 Oscar winners in this movie, people. It was really great. Jennifer has no lines or anything, no credit. But if you blink, you'll miss it. But she's there.
I want to give you an opportunity to plug your book. Lift up the cover again for your new book, and tell everybody about this book.
It's called "I Was a Teenage Monster Hunter: How I Met Vincent Price, Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing, and More." And when I was interviewing all of these great people for my fanzine back in the 70s, I did 35 interviews, and I decided to collect them all as time capsules into a book. But then I started writing the introductions to each one of how I bamboozled each interview, like that story I told you about Vincent Price with Diana Rigg and Christopher Lee on the set of Man with the Golden Gun, and all these amazing things that I bamboozled. And those stories were as interesting, if not more interesting, than the interviews. And then I kind of needed to set up how I even, my crazy monster kid childhood, and how my dad owned movie theaters and everything that we've been talking about. And so it became kind of half of a coming of age memoir. So it's half and half, collection of interviews and memoir. And I'm so proud of it. It's like 400 pages. It's got all these great color images and black and white images and cartoons that I had a cartoonist do. We also did the cover, which is a spoof of the Fearless Vampire Killers poster. And then I got Elvira to write the foreword, and I even have an audiobook, and she reads her foreword, and whoever, any of the interviewees that were still alive, I got them to come and record their answers to the interviews, like Jane Seymour and different Hammer film ladies and stuff, and then other actors to fill in for the ones who had passed away. Juliette Mills does Diana Rigg, for instance. So it's just a fabulous book.
I definitely, it looks like a great collectible, and people should pick it up through Amazon. And
yes, it's available hardcover, paperback, ebook, and audiobook on Amazon. And then my most recent book, if you'll indulge me, is one of my favorite Frankenstein films is Frankenstein: The True Story, a 2-part NBC movie from 1973. And it's had an all-star cast: James Mason, Leonard Whiting, Jane Seymour plays the female creature, Michael Sarrazin plays the creature, Agnes Moorehead, Sir Ralph Richardson, Sir John Gielgud, amazing cast. And I've always been obsessed with this. I even had it on the cover of one of my fanzines back in 1974. And I've written this entire book on the making of this movie, and it is the most incredible behind-the-scenes movie-making story you will ever read. You cannot believe what all went down. And every A-list director, actor, everybody was somehow wooed or involved or wanted to be in this. It was incredible. The script to the movie was written by Christopher Isherwood, so everybody, they were all dying to do it. I mean, Francis Ford Coppola begged to direct this movie right after The Godfather, and that's one example.
Who ended up directing the movie?
It was directed by Jack Smite because it was for television. Universal, they were terrified because Francis Ford Coppola had gone $1 million over budget, and Francis said he wanted to direct it, but he wanted them to turn it into a bigger budgeted theatrical film. And so that's why they ended up turning him down. He wanted Marlon Brando to play the role that ended up being played by James Mason, which is actually based on Dr. Pretorius. The character is Dr. Polidori, but it is Dr. Pretorius from Bride of Frankenstein. And the writers even named him Dr. Pretorius in the early drafts of the script. Anyway, don't get me started, obviously. The book is 400 pages. It has 1,350 photos. The foreword is by the late Anne Rice. This was the movie that inspired her to write Interview with the Vampire. And the afterword is by Guillermo del Toro. And it's a film that is very inspirational to him. And he is right now, as we speak, directing his own version of Frankenstein for Netflix, which I'm incredibly excited about. And so, again, this is another great book to check out. And it's also available in all formats on Amazon.
I wanted to ask you real quick. I forgot to ask you, when you were working on Elvira's Hidden Hills, you said that the movie was eventually financed by her and her husband?
Yes.
So you must have had a very small budget.
It did. It was about $1 million budget, and we shot it in Romania, where our money could go very far, and we built, because of all the cheap labor there, and we built the sets from the ground up, all to specification, the most beautiful sets you could ever imagine. And it was, of all the films I've directed, and I just finished directing my 55th. This is absolutely the most thrilling and satisfying movie for me to direct, for all those reasons of the Vincent Price connections and everything else. It's just, it's the most fun I've ever had, and I'm just so proud of it. And it's come out in this beautiful 20th anniversary edition with a slipcover from Shout Factory, and has 1 million extras on it. And
sounds like the movie made them back their money.
Well, it did not get properly distributed. And when it came out on DVD and stuff, it was not promoted well. Not very many people even saw it until just recently, and it almost feels like it's a new release. Shout Factory put this out during COVID in 2021, I guess, and it just took off. They did really, really well with this. And then it had never shown on television in all 20 years it had been out. And it's not on any streamer or anything. Now it's on a bunch of streamers, and people are discovering this right and left. I mean, we did a charity screening, Cassandra and I, in Portland, Oregon last year in a theater that was completely sold out, and people were going crazy. It's just, it's finding its audience now. It's amazing.
We work in a crazy business. Well, we could talk for another hour at least.
I know. Sorry, you can't shut me up.
Thank you for we're such kindred spirits because we love this business so much. We have been watching and listening to the great Sam Irvin, my former compatriot from Cinefantastique, and I'm your host. And Showtime. I'm your host, Steve Rubin. Our producer is Ben Shrewsbury. If you liked our show, please say so in the comments, and subscribe as you do to many podcasts. Thank you so much, Sam. This has been terrific.
Loved it. Thanks for having me, Steve.